Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, and in this programme we'll be discussing how the United States of America, together with Israel, at the end of last month carried out their biggest military exercise in their history, and we'll be asking, what does this mean, and is this in preparation for a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities? Does this indicate a shift in US foreign policy by the Biden administration to understand Israel's dire security situations in the Middle East if the Iranian regime acquires nuclear weapons? Reagan, this is such an important topic, but when I was looking to see what topics we could discuss for this week, I go to my usual source of information of various other websites to do with Israel and the Middle East and others. And I was only just scrolling across kind of CBN's kind of YouTube videos, and they mentioned this. And really, this hasn't had hardly any media traction whatsoever, including in the Israeli press. Had a little bit there, but not much. But I mean, this is what we've seen happen in the end of January, is the biggest military exercises ever carried out by the United States and Israel together, in what looks like they are clearly sending a strong military message to those in Tehran.
Well, it really is incredible. I mean, just check out some of these figures we had. It was the last week of January. The operation codenamed Juniper Oak featured some 1,500 Israeli soldiers, 6,400 U.S. troops, 140 military aircraft, and 12 naval ships. If that is not a display of military power, I don't know what is. This is believed to be in preparation for some form of military offensive against Iran's nuclear facilities, a potential intervention that we've been speculating about, talking about since early last year. There's definitely been that warning, I believe we had over a year ago now, multiple interviews where there was an indication that it was a matter of weeks or months before Iran reached full capabilities in their nuclear program. Certainly that's advanced. There's been this delayed nuclear deal that the U.S. has been trying to work on with Iran via Russia, and it's become a very chaotic situation. So I don't think there's any coincidence here that this is the U.S. teaming up with historically one of its strongest allies, the strongest ally definitely in the Middle East, to have a display of military power, just almost as a warning shot. It could be that America is looking at this as, Iran, you need to sign the terms and conditions on the deal we want soon, or this is what you could be facing, or it could be literally just drills for what they view as something that is an almost certain coming war.
Absolutely, or it's a different perspective between the Pentagon and the US Department of Defense and that of Biden in the White House. I just want to break down some of the figures as well, because obviously different articles, different information. I actually got this article from the Times of Israel and information as well from the Washington Institute as well. So it says here, between the 23rd and the 26th of January, 6,400 US troops took part in this joint US-Israel military exercise. 1,500 Israeli soldiers and over 142 aircraft, 100 American, 42 Israelis, 12 naval warships, including the George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group, and a submarine. Artillery systems from both nations involved in Juniper Oak 2023. And this was to include cooperation in military spheres, sea, land, air, and cyber. I mean, the interesting thing now is that traditionally, the military would incorporate the air, so clearly fighter jets, fighter aircraft, ground troops, and also the sea, Navy battleships together with submarines. But also now increasingly, as we're heading further into the 21st century, cyber warfare is also becoming an increasingly
live issue.
But I think also the significant thing about this one is because Israel carried out huge military exercise back in June of 2022, but that was without US military involvement. This time included US military involvement. And the fact that if Israelis and the American military cooperated together, they could virtually send Tehran, Iran and its regime back into the Stone Age.
Well, what's interesting is there's denial on the American side of things. American officials have denied that they've used real mock-ups of Iranian targets. At the same time, Israel's Channel 12 News has reported that, again, without a source, but they did report that part of the drill did include American bombers targeting a simulated Iranian nuclear facility. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy as to what exactly happened there, but it is very common for the nations undergoing war games to include potential mock-ups, mock-ups of potential strike zones. And so it's not very far-fetched to think that this could be the case. But it does indicate a bit of a shift, a significant shift, you could say, in the Biden administration's approach to Israel as well as Iran. They've been bartering for this deal with Iran in regard to its nuclear capabilities. That deal does look to be dead in the water. There's ongoing concerns that we've talked about on previous episodes in relation to Russia and Ukraine. Iran is supplying drones to Russia and other military hardware. So this is Russia already being at odds with NATO and Western nations due to its illegal invasion of Ukraine and the war crimes it's committing. It is now in a situation where they're actively joined hands with one of the greatest terror threats to the world. So it is quite prudent for the U.S. to engage in, at the very least, some simulated scenarios wherein they might be forced to engage in military conflict alongside Israel against Iran.
Absolutely. I mean, according to this one, drill simulated complex operational scenarios, including aircraft and ships targeting, simulating naval threats. So the US used their B-52 bombers dropping live ammunition in southern Israel and a joint command and control in order to enhance their shared ability to counter regional threats, the IDF have said. Now, what's also interesting about this one is that if, and I think it's only a question of time, Reagan, before we see a potential Israeli military airstrikes, excuse me, on Iran's nuclear facilities, because we know that according to the former IDF chief of staff, he was saying that he believes that the Iranians possibly have 2 or 3 nuclear weapons already. It's only when a nation actually tests the bomb do they actually realise then that there's a point of no return. They need also then the delivery systems to actually get the nuclear warhead, put it on one of their ballistic missiles and have that capability of actually launching it. So there's still time, but time is running out rapidly. The Israeli government have had red lines and the Iranians have crossed those red lines. I think, excuse me, that they are producing uranium at 60% capacity at the moment.
Yeah, let's go to this news report from our friends at CBN walking us through some of the particulars of Operation Juniper Oak. This is indeed Israel's largest ever joint military drill alongside the United States.
Seth Franzman, thanks for joining us. You wrote an article in the Jerusalem Post about a joint U.S.-Israel exercise called Juniper Oak. Why was that so important?
Well, it's the largest exercise that apparently has ever happened between Israel and the United States. And it also comes under U.S. Central Command. Several years ago, Israel was under actually European Command, which is similar to Turkey in the region, partly because Israel didn't have a lot of relations with countries in the region. But U.S. Central Command, which is the main command that, as people know, ran the global war on terror in places like Iraq and Syria. So it's logical that Israel would be underneath their area of operations. And this massive drill brought together something like 140 aircraft, including B-52s flown all the way from the U.S., F-35s, F-15s, F-16s. I mean, just a massive amount of weaponry and ordnance. There was the use of precision artillery systems, and there was a bunch of naval boats, including an aircraft carrier. So this was a very important exercise. It just shows how Israel is, the key U.S. ally in the region.
What impact does it have in the region?
I think, as we all know, there's a lot of tensions with Iran. We saw just this week, there were some allegations of some sort of a drone attack in Isfahan. So I think that showing that the U.S. and Israel are on the same page is very, very important. It doesn't mean that all this is coordinated. I mean, the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken is in Israel today, but CENTCOM doesn't necessarily coordinate all that with the State Department. But it is important to show that Israel and the U.S. is just a really important strategic partnership. And I think the U.S. has a lot of tensions with its other partners in the region, or historical partners, whether it's Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Egypt. Israel is really the one country that the United States can rely on here. And I think this is just really, really being brought home by this massive exercise and all the way in which it shows that the IDF and U.S. forces really plug in well together and are able to train together.
Does this send a clear signal to Iran?
Definitely. If you're the Iranian regime and you're building, drones or missiles or a nuclear program or whatever, I mean, they don't add up when it comes to looking at the immense power that the United States and Israel can project here. Iran doesn't have a real air force. It doesn't have a big conventional military. It does have these systems like missiles, and it is building these nuclear arms apparently. But when you just see 140 aircraft coming together, I mean, this is just an immense amount of power, especially with B-52s and things like that can be projected in the region. I think Iran understands that it doesn't want to mess around here, and that the Iranian regime is not in the place it was 5 years ago. It doesn't have a lot of friends in the West or Washington anymore.
At the end of your article, Seth, you said Juniper Oak is a curtain raiser on the future of combat in the Middle East. What do you mean by that?
I think the use of unmanned systems, drones, I think the use of this HIMARS system, which is a precision artillery that's been deployed in Ukraine, the F-35s, and a lot of the technology behind this just shows a kind of way in which warfare is becoming, faster, more high-tech, more artificial intelligence, more digital. Israel, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it was a very important military in the region. It was able to defeat countries in the region, but in terms of its abilities to be one-to-one with the United States, it just wasn't there. I think nowadays we're all seeing the degree to which it's making technology that is on U.S. tanks. It's making the technology that helps the United States. So we're just seeing a really unique and unprecedented partnership. And that's why I think when we look at the next kind of conflicts that will be fought, what we saw in Juniper Oak is an evidence of how those conflicts will go.
Sending a signal to Iran, a question's been asked for years. Will Israel, with U.S. help, attack Iran's nuclear facilities? And if so, can they be effective?
I don't think we know the answer to that. I think it's clear that Israel has said that there's a red line somewhere. The United States says that, all options on the table. I think that everyone understands if the Iranians decide that they want to keep pursuing an actual nuclear bomb and enrich all the Iranians, stockpile it, and then build some sort of a device, there is a point at which you get to a red line. We don't know where exactly that is, but the Iranian regime, I think, certainly understands that. And that's why we've seen them been tinkering with a bomb for like 20 years. And that's why they haven't actually tested one.
Well, Seth Frantzman, thanks for joining us on CBN News.
Thank you.
We now have a special guest from the United States. His name is Dr. Harold Rode. He advised 5 former U.S. Secretaries of Defense in the Pentagon. He's one of the world's leading experts on Iran, Islam, and the Middle East. Harold, it's an absolute pleasure that you can join us on Behind the Headlines today.
It's nice being here. Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Harold, can you just give us your thoughts on what has been described as the biggest military exercise between your nation, the United States, and the nation of Israel that occurred at the end of January? I'll just go through some of the actual figures. So there was 6,400 US troops involved, 140 military aircraft, 12 naval ships, 1,500 Israeli soldiers. What do you make of this huge military exercise between the United States and Israel that took place at the end of January?
Well, to begin with, listen, I don't have any sources within either the Biden administration or the Israeli government at the moment, but I have had many, many years in dealing with both countries, and especially with Iran. And here's for what it's worth. This is what I think. Number one, I think that America and Israel had very different views of the importance of these exercises. From an American point of view, I think the Americans, more than anything, still want to reach an agreement with Iran. And the answer is the Israelis understand that this is an existential problem for them. If the agreement takes place, it will allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb. And Israel can't afford that because the Iranians say very clearly that Israel is a cancer, it needs to be destroyed, it should be wiped off the face of the earth. And Jewish history is filled with stories that when tyrants say they're going to destroy or they're going to kill Israel, that when they threaten the Jewish people, they do it. So Israel doesn't have the luxury of getting it wrong here. The Americans, on the other hand, do. In the long run, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it will be a very serious threat to America, which, whether it likes it or not, is the leader of the free world. And I say that because most Americans understand that we are the leader of the free world, even if this particular government in the United States wants to lead from behind, as former President Obama said. And the people running the government today in America are the same people that ran it under Obama. No difference. Anyway, so the Americans can afford to get it wrong for the near future. The Israelis cannot. And so the Americans, the idea of having a big military exercises, it's sort of the American way to assure the Israelis that America has its back. Well, there are very few Israelis that believe that. Unfortunately, most of the people that the American government has contact with in Israel, that it relies on, the newspapers that it relies on, are a tiny, tiny minority. And it's very, very strange because in Israel, everything is completely open. People have no problem saying what their views are. And the American government hasn't a clue, basically, of what the Israeli people think. Now, the proof that and look, America is really, right now, there are all these demonstrations in Israel. There's even been a threat to kill the Israeli prime minister. And the whole goal of the Americans and this very small minority in Israel is to overturn the Netanyahu government. The point is that there are all these public opinion surveys, and unlike public opinion surveys throughout the Middle East, in Israel, they do matter. Why? Because the Israelis have absolutely no problem. They're not the slightest bit afraid to say what they think. And the Americans and this small group have failed to change, to move public opinion. Why? Because if elections were held tomorrow, it's very clear that the same government would still get a majority and still, again, come back to power.
So Dr. Rode, could I ask, do you believe that Tehran could look at this military exercise and view it as a sort of veiled threat? I mean, there's nothing new with war games. There's nothing new with military exercises between close allies. It's been said that this isn't targeting any particular nation or having any nation in view. But certainly, with the close proximity and the ongoing discussions regarding nuclear deal with Iran, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, Iran could look at this and think it's a show of power.
Yeah, I hear your argument, but again, my job here is to look at it from an Iranian perspective. And Iran knows that militarily it's no match for the United States, but it knows how to play the United States. And it is, in essence, and Iranians do things usually indirectly. They don't come out and they get other people. They get other people in the world to do the things that they want done, and so therefore they can't be directly blamed. And so what Iran sees here is just they're trying to help America get to an agreement that the Americans so desperately want, and the Iranians, well, they want to sign something, so they constantly throw things out there. which here's a chance, Iranians want to talk, and so in this particular instance, I can't prove this, but I would think from an Iranian point of view, they see what Americans done is nothing more than saber rattling. Look, we just didn't shoot down. Here, this Chinese balloon came over the United States, and why didn't we shoot it down? Are we afraid? This is here is basically an intrusion into the United States, and America does nothing. And when Iranian leaders give speeches so often, right behind them in Persian, the language of Iran, the national language of Iran, is a phrase which says, America can't do a damn thing. America is weak. It yells, it talks a lot, but in the end, it caves. And so the Iranians are just trying to help the Americans as if to soothe the Israelis, to pacify the Israelis. But in the end, the Americans are constantly looking for a way to have an agreement. And State Department and most of the international foreign ministries in the world, they think, a signed agreement is everything. The Iranians see it as a dumb piece of paper, and that's it. That's all.
Yeah, and Harold, how critical is the situation now? I mean, we saw that at the end of January that the Americans and the Israelis carried out their biggest military exercise of all time, and Israel has been increasingly carrying out military exercises into knowing how that they would respond to targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, because we know the regime is hell-bent on having nuclear weapons, which would be a total game changer in the Middle East. So how close is Iran from developing nuclear weapons? Some reports say they already have 3 or 4 already, but obviously not deliverable. But what would an Israeli airstrike on Iran's nuclear facilities mean for the Middle East, and how would the Iranians respond?
Well, again, I'm not a military expert, and if shall we say, the attempt is to destroy the Iranian nuclear program, do you need Israeli airplanes to attack? Anything, for example, all this stuff is underground that the Iranians have. And in order to work underground, you need electricity, you need water, you need food. So there are ways of getting in and out. And there are ways of doing all sorts of artificial intelligence things to make difficulties for Iran. I don't know if it would have to be an actual physical attack from the outside, from the military people. I mean, I spent many years at the Pentagon, so I have some basic knowledge of how the military operates, and they can do awesome things with today's technologies from afar. So I can't answer really what would it look like. But in the end, I'm just saying in the end that from a political point of view, there is no way that the present Israeli government will trust the government the United States has today. The American people maybe is a different thing, but the American people aren't making the decisions here. It's the government it's the bureaucracy and the government that is in power in the United States, which, from my point of view, represents also a very small way of looking at the world. It's not how most Americans see the world. Most Americans are great. They love America. They're not internationalists. They want to defend this country if, God forbid, something goes wrong. And that's that.
Yeah. And finally, Harold, how critical is it that you talked about the technologies, military technologies at the disposal of the US Pentagon, but how much does Israel need American help and the backing of the Biden administration if the Israelis decided to carry out military airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, or use AI technology, or decided to blow up Iran's electric plants and water plants that are very near these hidden underground nuclear reactors where they are determined to produce nuclear weapons?
Well, Again, this is just my opinion. I don't believe that the Israeli government trusts the American government to make decisions in the which would be good for Israel. And in the end, Israel is a sovereign country. It has to make its own decisions. And that means that if Israel does intend to attack Iran, whatever way it does, I don't think America would have foreknowledge.
Harold Rode, we want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. Great to see you again, and thank you for your excellent contribution to the programme. Valued as ever. So shalom and God bless. Thank you.
Well, that's extremely helpful commentary there. Simon, what are your thoughts on what it's been shared?
Well, I thought it was really interesting. You've had Dr. Harold Rode really work with the 5 US Secretaries of Defense. His ties to Israel are unprecedented, considered one of the world's leading experts on Islam, as well as on Iran. I mean, he speaks fluent Farsi and other Middle Eastern languages, so knows the mentality of the Iranians very well. And I think what it really does show is there's a total disconnect, I think, in the United States between the US State Department, the White House, and the US Defense Department. And clearly the defense officials are feeling that they need to get a grip of what's happening in the Middle East, particularly with the likelihood of Iran reaching nuclear breakout. They want to kind of see that Israel is their greatest ally and friend in the Middle East to line them up. But also we have to look at the context of this as well, is that prior to this, Russia was the most dominant player in the Middle East. And since their invasion of the Ukraine, their credibility in the region has been shot to pieces. And I think this also means that the Americans have an opportunity to show their strength in the Middle East and in the region.
Yeah, very definitely, and they have done just that. I mean, it included the drills that they undertook, saw them tag team, basically looking at cooperation between the various types of military hardware. Included refueling Israeli fighter jets from an American Boeing KC-46, which Israel is expected themselves to receive in 2025. Israeli Navy's SAR 5 class corvettes refueling from an American replenishment tank to expand the IDF's ranges and areas of operation in routine and emergency situations. As well. There was a live fire event with 140 aircraft, including B-52s, F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, FA-18s, AC-130 Hercules transports. You name it, it goes through the whole list looking at rocket launch systems. So you have to look at this.
You missed the Apache helicopters.
Well, I missed the Apache. Yeah, the Apaches as well. A-864 Apache helicopters, 12 naval vessels, high mobility artillery rocket systems, and then multiple launch rocket systems as well. Juniper Oak, the whole idea behind this operation seems to be integrating assets such as special operations forces, infantry, and spare forces, so space forces as well. I mean, you know, this is fairly recent stuff, but integrating that into it. So what we're seeing is definitely a preparation for a tight alliance in an actual wartime scenario.
Because I think we have to really kind of break down the scenario that Israel would face if the Americans, I mean, preferably I think it would be Benjamin Netanyahu's choice that the Americans carried out the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. I think that would be the Israeli government's favoured choice. But next, if the Americans wouldn't have the courage or the bravery to do what is right, no one wants war, but sometimes you have to go to war to make peace. And the world would be an increasingly dangerous place if the Iranian regime acquired nuclear weapons. It would be a game changer. They would then be able to threaten their Arab neighbours, including Israel, with annihilation, and the rest of the Arab world with annihilation. They have ballistic missiles that would be capable of hitting Europe or even the United States. They could continue their support for international terrorism. and together with possibly even giving Islamist terrorist organizations a dirty bomb and carrying out a nuclear attack without any fear of reprisals. And it also protects the regime's survival if they are able to acquire nuclear weapons and have nuclear weapons capabilities. This is why the regime wants it. But there is also a school of thought inside the Iranian regime, and the previous Iranian president, President Ahmadinejad, was of this view that they felt it was the Iranian responsibility of the Iranian government to prepare the world for the apocalypse in order for the 12th Imam or the Mahdi or the Islamic Shia Messiah to rule and reign from Tehran. And so wanting an apocalyptic showdown with the West and with Israel. But also to explain as well that there has been a shift, that Israel was originally in CENTCOM in Europe, but now they've been in the Middle East because of the success of the Abraham Accords. And according to the Times of Israel, CENTCOM expanded its area of responsibility to include Israel on the 1st of September 2021, taking over from the European Command, and a change announced during the final days of the Trump administration. And despite its location in the Middle East, Israel has been part of EUCOM's area of responsibility for several decades, largely to avoid friction between Israel and Arab militaries. However, with deepening ties between Israel and several Arab countries, coupled with the growing threats from Iran, a need for a better coordination between the Israelis and the American forces in the region was deemed a necessity. And this is why we're seeing a shift in American and Israeli operations, that Israel now plays a central key role in America's military objectives for the Middle East.
Now, they remain insistent that there's not any one nation that is in view here. However, I think if we were to believe that, it would be slightly disingenuous, because they then proceed to make a slightly, you could say, thinly veiled threat in one way to Iran. The scale of the exercise, a spokesman, a U.S. official says, is relevant to a whole range of scenarios, and Iran may draw certain inferences from that, which is directly implying that they desire Iran to gain inferences from this. Look at the power that we have, look at what we can do, look at the resources that we are able to use, that we have at our ready disposal. They said it's really meant mostly to kick the tires of our ability to do things at this scale with the Israelis against a whole range of different threats. But what is the primary threat? They go on to say, but you know, it would not surprise me if Iran sees the scale and the nature of these activities and understands what the two of us are capable of doing, the source added, which is very clearly indicating, okay, look, this is the real live threat at the moment. This is the situation that we're talking about, where the U.S. and Israel would be most likely to engage in some sort of joint military operation. Now, according to an interview with IDF Chief Herzi Halevi, we have Herzi Halevi saying Israel and the U.S. share the same values. The IDF and CENTCOM share the same outlook on the threats facing this region, adding that the drill raised our level of planning and implementation of combined operations. Israel is capable of defending itself, but it's always good to have our greatest partner beside us to learn from one another. This operational partnership strengthens our ability to deal with a wide range of security challenges in the region. These were remarks that Halevi said, published by the IDF. We're going to go now to another news report that looked ahead at this massive military drill that Israel has conducted, simulating an attack on Iran's nuclear sites.
Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz stressed the importance of dealing with Iran prior to leaving for Washington to meet with American military leaders.
Iran continues to accumulate irreversible knowledge and experience in the development, research, production, and operation of advanced centrifuges. It stands just a few weeks away from accumulating fissile material that will be sufficient for a first bomb.
In Washington, Gantz met his U.S. counterpart, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and urged the U.S. to take the lead when it comes to Iran. According to a statement from his office, Gantz told Austin, "We must act decisively against Iran's mounting regional aggression in a variety of ways. This includes strengthening a practical coalition under U.S. leadership together with regional partners." This is all happening as Israel plans a large-scale military drill practicing a potential attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, Israeli media reports say. The incoming U.S. military commander in this region was also in Israel for the first time discussing the Iranian nuclear threat with Israeli military chiefs. Exercises are set to take place over the Mediterranean Sea as part of the ongoing Chariots of Fire military drill. The U.S. Air Force is also expected to take part in a move that many say sends a message to Iran.
I think what's historic is that the Biden administration is having America's military participate, specifically refueling Israeli jets, which is something very important.
Middle East expert Eli Kohanim says after more than a year of negotiating an updated Iran nuclear deal, it's time to consider military action against what she calls an axis of evil that includes China and Russia.
It's really time for the Biden administration to put this option back on the table and show this access that the United States will go to the military option if necessary. And we're going to continue to defend our own national security interests as well as our allies in the region.
Meanwhile, as sanctions continue to squeeze Iran, Kohanim says recent protests there go beyond economic woes.
They very quickly turned political, with people in the streets of Iran at the threat of their own lives chanting "Death to Khamenei."
Kohanim says Iranians want their government to be concerned with the welfare of its citizens instead of trying to rule over others. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
So that CBN news report we saw there was back from sometime in 2022, and we know that situations change very, very quickly, but one thing we can and are witnessing is the increasing military cooperation between the US and Israel and their enemy, which is not named here, but namely the mullahs in Tehran and a nuclear-armed Iran. Reagan, now the response to Israel's new Prime Minister, also Israel's old Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to this joint military exercise, he says, "The exercise expresses the unshakable strategic partnership between Israel and the US and constitutes an additional stage in building up Israeli military strength. Israel will always defend itself with its own forces, but of course welcomes a deepening cooperation with our greatest ally." And we see that there was also a track record in increasing military exercises taking place between Israel and her allies. So back in November, the IDF and the US held a series of joint aerial exercises stimulating strikes against Iran and its regional terror proxies. The then IDF chief, Avi Kochavi, that month said that the joint activities with the US military in the Middle East would be significantly expanded. And then we saw on the 2nd of June 2022, the Israeli Defense Forces wrapped up their major military exercise in Cyprus, stimulating a military ground offensive deep inside Lebanon in a potential war against the Iranian-backed Hezbollah terror group. The Mediterranean island was chosen both for its Lebanon-like terrain, mountainous along with a coastal plain, its proximity to Israel. The drill stimulated various difficulties in ground pursuits such as food, water and ammunition. I mean, what is becoming clear, isn't it, is that from an Israeli military perspective, they are definitely gearing up to a potential strike, but also preparing for what would be the Iranian response to such a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, such as Hezbollah launching anything between 140 to 160,000 rockets and missiles to target Israel. You would probably see Hamas as well fire their rockets and missiles into Israel from Gaza, and if not also potentially a third intifada coming from the Palestinian Authority as well, as the Palestinian Authority are losing security over those towns that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, and that's why this military exercise and others like it that have been being carried out, known and unknown, are so important to make sure that there's a range of scenarios that have been prepared for, that both the United States and Israel rest secure in the knowledge of each other's companionship in being allies in time of warfare and crisis. The ability to see an overlap of military hardware and technology. How does it work? How can it work to make sure that everything is seamless when with that potential threat? Of course, you can look at the United States and Israel in terms of their military hardware and technology. It far outpowers and outweighs that of their enemies. At the same time, if they were to work together or suddenly find themselves in a situation where they're thrown together in combat and they're unable to understand the other side's usage of certain things, then it could be absolutely disastrous. But they have, you mentioned Lebanon a moment ago, they have also prepared for the strikes, potential strikes in relation to Lebanon. They chose Cyprus, as you mentioned, for this particular drill because of its Lebanon-like terrain. So that they're not even trying to hide what they have in view here. They are sending a very clear signal. We know that the plans you have are for the ill of Israel. They wouldn't go against the United States, but that they are saying very clearly they know what's being planned. They know where everything could lead. We're ready for you.
And I think the difference in this particular situation, I think that we're facing, if Israel faces the same scenario, say last year before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, it would be a very different calculations, because they would have to calculate a Russian response. Knowing that President Putin has deployed air to surface air missiles in Iran, next to Iran's nuclear facilities. There are Russian nuclear scientists that have been working on Iran's nuclear weapons program. We also see that that Russia has anywhere between 80, maybe 90, 120,000 of some of its best troops still in Syria that propped up Assad's regime. And so a year ago, Israel and America would have to deal with possibly a Russian retaliation or a Russian response. And I think because of the how badly the war in Ukraine is going for the Russian forces, and we mentioned last week on the Behind the Headlines that Russia has lost somewhere in the region of 100,000 men who are dead, and these are soldiers, injured, or those who've deserted, don't anywhere look like the capability of taking on Israel or protecting Iran in the Middle East. We also know that the Iranian regime is a paper tiger. We know that there's a lot of talk, and this really expressed from what Dr. Harold Rhodes said about the Iranians, is that they project strength in the Middle East. And if America sees itself, as it should, as the world's remaining superpower with the incredible military arsenal at its disposal, then this would indicate that the Iranians are absolutely no match for Israeli and American military technology, and probably the same thing would happen as we saw in the Ukraine. There is no way the Iranians would be able to respond. And the big difference I learned when I attended the Christian Media Summit in Jerusalem, asking some of the Iranian experts, there was previous concerns that if the Israelis or the Americans carried out airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, this could rally the Iranian people behind the regime. And they believe that situation now just wouldn't happen. People are so angry at the Iranian regime. It's oppression of human rights, it's oppression of women's rights, the stamping down of liberty. Everyone in Iran that doesn't have an economic or a political interest tied to the Iranian regime wants to see the regime collapse, and they want to see the mullahs go. And so therefore, they would actually welcome military airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities that would cripple them. But I mean, it would be a major undertaking, because not only would you have to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, you'd have to take out the air defense systems, You would have to then take out the Air Force, that they couldn't then retaliate. And in some way, you'd want to send Iran back into the Stone Age by destroying its internet capacities, its electrical grids, its water grids. So then the Iranian regime doesn't have the capabilities of actually responding. But we know that they would respond through Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as well. And that is the terrorism threat that Israel faces. And of course, American troops, American embassies, British embassies based in the Middle East as well would also be threatened with a retaliation.
Well, this has to be considered before any action is taken, that there's always going to be somewhat of a butterfly effect. You're going to have, and it's not as simple as a preemptive attack. It never is as simple as a preemptive attack. They can carry out an attack, but there will be shockwaves and hot spots of conflict that will undoubtedly come up as a result. Maybe not primarily from Iran. But it's an important question to ask, and there is a CBN News report that we go to now asking the question, will Israel attack Iran to stop its nuclear program?
In 2012, Yaakov Katz, now the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, served as the paper's defense analyst. As co-author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, he examined the potential for an attack on Iran's nuclear program.
It seemed at the time that Israel was capable of doing it. I distinctly remember one meeting that I was brought into at the Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv with the top Air Force general who basically laid out, rolled out a map on a table and showed us how the Israeli Air Force squadrons would fly to Iran.
At the time, Israel prepared night and day.
The Air Force had been training extensively for this operation. Billions and billions of shekels had been poured into this planning and to training and to buying up the munitions and the technology and the weapons that would be needed to take out some of the facilities.
Then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak tried but failed to convince the cabinet, army and security chiefs to take action.
In the end, that never happened. So that was the backdrop back in 2012. And it seemed real, it seemed viable, and it seemed like Israel had a real opportunity to cause enough damage to set back Iran's nuclear program.
Now, 10 years later, the problem and targets remain the same. Natanz, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility. Fordow, with thousands of centrifuges burrowed into a mountain. To the west, Iraq, where a heavy water plutonium facility is under construction. And further south, Iran's uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. Since this scenario hasn't changed in 10 years, what about Israel's military capability?
Israel today, Chris, is stronger than it was back in 2012, right? If back in 2012 we had F-15s and F-16s, those are fourth-generation fighter jets that are detectable on radar. Today we have F-35s. These are the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighters, that have stealth-like capabilities that can basically go fly into an enemy airspace, not be detected, and can take out radar installations as well as surface-to-air missile systems, can basically pave the way for then the big heavy bombers, the F-15s and the F-16s, to come in and drop a ton of munitions all over these different facilities to destroy them.
The question a lot of people have been asking over and over again throughout the years, can Israel do it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated today, Chris. I think that back in 2012, the feeling was that, yes, it could do it. Then Iran's nuclear program is not as advanced as it is today. It was not as heavily fortified as it is today. It was not as dispersed as it is today. With that said, even then, it would have been just causing enough damage to set them back for a period of time.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg laid out a number of top stories to look at in 2022. At the top of the list, an Israeli attack on Iran.
We've never had to do it before. Covert operations and all kinds of other shadow activities to keep Iran from getting the bomb without having to go to what's called a kinetic war, a full-on actual war.
Katz points out even if there were an attack, it wouldn't be the end of the story.
And I think that no one has any illusion to believe that if Israel attacks Iran, that's it. There's never going to be a nuclear program. No, there can be, because the Iranians have the domestic know-how, they have the technology, it's in their heads. And while you can destroy their facilities and infrastructure, you can't take away that knowledge.
Plus, any military move likely leads to a regional war, with Iran unleashing Hezbollah its arm in Lebanon to fire thousands of missiles into Israel.
That is not a war we want to be in. We might have to do it, but I mean, those stakes are just so high, and I think to me, that's the far away the biggest story.
I think that Israel has means at its disposal. The question, though, comes down to, is it worth it? Is the damage that you will cause Iran's nuclear infrastructure going to be worth the war that will ensue, the international condemnations that you will almost definitely face from the world?
It's an age-old dilemma that now faces a new set of Israeli leaders.
I don't think Israel can live with a nuclear Iran, right? I think a nuclear Iran has the potential to pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's not like I'm saying we should just sit back and let this happen. No, we have to do what we have to do, but we also have to realize that sometimes power has its limits. So it's complicated.
As Israeli military and political leaders increasingly warn about a looming attack, Rosenberg believes Israel's options are running out.
I don't hear it as hyperbolic. I don't hear it as trying to, be sensationalistic. I think Israeli leaders are realizing this is it. Iran has gone past all of the previous red lines that any Israeli government has ever said. But no Israeli prime minister wants to go to war.
The threat, sadly, is still there, and it needs to be dealt with. I would hope and pray that it can be dealt without the use of force, without the need for war and bloodshed. That is always the Israeli and Jewish preference, right, is to be able to do this through peaceful means, through dialogue, through discussion, through a deal. But unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
And another part of history also remains, as Katz points out, often the Jewish people stand alone.
That famous saying of Hillel the Elder, a Jewish scholar from the period of the Talmud from a couple thousand years ago, who said back in the time in Hebrew, "Eina nidli mili," which translates into English, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And what was true thousands of years ago for the Jewish people is still so true in the year 2022.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Another excellent report there by CBN on the question that we want to know: will Israel carry out, or together now with the United States, airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities to prevent the Iranian regime from acquiring nuclear breakout? I think at this point it's important to make a distinction between the leadership in Tehran, who are corrupt, evil dictators, and the people of Iran who are struggling for their freedom and liberty. And the one thing we could see from the Biden administration is that they could be doing far more to stand with the women of Iran, to stand with those suffering, to speak up for their freedoms in Iran, as well as the underground church as well. But of course, we don't hear too much. We heard a little bit from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, but not enough to put the Iranian regime on notice. And I think with this massive military exercise, there are two messages coming out of this, I think. One's coming out of Israel and Jerusalem by saying, look, we have the backing of our American friends. This is the military armada that you will face if you continue your nuclear weapons program. And also with the Americans are thinking like the US military would back Israel in terms of carrying out a military operation against the Iranian regime. But the Biden administration probably wouldn't. And so there's a complete disconnect and discord between different branches of the US executive, which is very dangerous, particularly when it comes to military planning and operations, that you can have the military preparations in place, but you also need the political will. And what we've seen over the last few years is a deterioration in the security situation in the Middle East and around the world.
And as we wrap up the program now, Simon, ultimately, there's going to be a lot of thought, a lot of speculation in regard to where this fits into Bible prophecy. We've had some programs where we've talked a little bit about that. We need to ultimately keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. We need to pray that God's will would be done in this situation as we are in the end times.
Reagan, a pleasure joining you on another edition of Behind the Headlines. I want to thank you so much for watching this program. I think it's imperative that we continue to pray for Israel's security. We pray also that Israel's enemies wouldn't succeed, because they are enemies not only of Israel, but also of the West. And we need to call out this vile, evil regime in Tehran. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.